What is up, y'all? It's your boy Anki coming at you with another My Hero Academia review for chapter 336. So if you haven't read it, you gotta go. You already know. Now, we're doing the page-by-page breakdown, so let's begin. You know I don't like to waste time with these. So, opening up with the top 10 for the latest popularity poll. No women, no villains. You can tell the anime clearly had some influence in this poll with, Shinso and I guess Present Might getting love off of this stuff. Aizawa's pretty consistently in the top 10 lately. Rhodey, movie character showing up, getting some love. Yeah, I think the fact that, so on the stream today, we actually went ahead and looked at some of the past polls, and throughout the history of My Hero, there's only been about 2 polls where villains cracked top 10, and it was the 5th poll and the 6th one. So, look, I know every now and then you see some people on Twitter that happen to say, like, oh yeah, they use Japanese, so maybe they're from Japan, maybe they're just somebody using Google Translate, or somebody who studied the language for business, whatever. Sometimes, clearly that's not the majority, and we just gotta kind of accept that. It's like I pointed out in my live reaction, as much as a lot of people in the United States and different parts of the world don't care for the more fillery episodes, Japan loves them. That Ochako Beach episode was one of the highest rated of the season. It is what it is. You just gotta accept the fact that they are invested in different aspects of the story, and they aren't as invested in the villains, though it does disappoint me, of course, but we just kind of gotta accept that. That's the world we live in now, So, first off, with the sparring matchup we open up with, I really love that we're finally getting confirmation and an explanation on how Bakugou's, quote, awakening worked with the cluster shots. As, a lot of people have advocated for this being awakening, and my philosophy has always been that awakening is you just understanding how to utilize your quirk a bit better, or the understanding and interpretation of it. Now, it's important to note that when Bakugou would have first unlocked these cluster shots, he was in an extremely intense situation. His body was in an extreme example of fight or flight mode after being critically wounded. You could see that he was sweating buckets back in the image. So all around, he was drenched. So this just makes sense. It was just the amount of sweat and him trying to make a condensed thing, basically setting out certain little droplets. And it's worth noting that if you go back to when they were doing from Class 1A to Midoriya, during that section of the story, Bakugou, when he's using his cluster shots, you can actually see individual little dots drawn around his fingertips. Those were likely not charges, but sweat droplets that he had saved up while pursuing Deku so that he could do a cluster explosion to accelerate them further. That's the kind of detail that we're talking about with these fights. Now, we see that Bakugo is using his winter outfit specifically because of the fact that this one lets him overheat so he can get access to those cluster bombs more reliably and faster. So more than likely going forward, Bakugo is going to be a character who, it's almost like Bakugo is consistently being forced to train and work in like a harder condition, and in the process, just like how Enji, who had to deal with overheating through like the flames, he's going to be sweating and dehydrating. So both of them kind of dealing with these dehydration symptoms. Bakugo being the endeavor to Deku's All Might in this situation, and just kind of seeing him take this quirk further and further. And of course, we already know that like more than likely what the story is going to do over time is just make it where Bakugo adjusts to this new level of dehydration, just like Shoto's seen and shown getting better at maintaining both sides, using those and practicing getting his tolerance up, and just trying to make his whole body being able to use both optimally. If you've seen the movie, you've seen some of the ways that he's supposed to be able to use his ice by now. We didn't get that highlighted quite as well during the war arc, so looking forward to that. Now, Kaminari and Mineta talking about how they think it would be the optimal time to go after All for One, or they're at least asking and wondering if maybe they should be taking advantage of this situation, and they feel like they should be able to make quick work. And I like this because it shows Bakugou and Momo playing off each other, but showing that mutual respect and intellect, while still, so it kind of highlights who's been taking on that leadership role and pulling people together within the classroom and really guiding the strategy missions and stuff going forward. And since Deku's been gone, and that's been Bakugou and Momo, it seems, based on the dynamic and the way they kind of just fall into this. But first of all, Bakugou highlights how One of the reasons they can't do that is because people have been able to track down all kinds of people, but they've never been able to track down All for One. I don't think there's a single person who, if you asked them where All for One is, if they would guess it, would guess that he was in a cave somewhere. That's not the kind of person you would expect All for One to be, because you see him being so egotistical, so vain. He, in the sense, he even put a throne in a cave. But what it really is that he can be all these forms of vain and acknowledging his own status and his self-perception as a demon lord and all these other things, but he'll also do the thing that's humble enough and hide where he needs to hide, and hide in places that you'd never think a person so vain would go. You would think he would see himself as above, like squatting in a cave, because you thought the League of Villains were in a bad spot when they were camping out, posted up, loitering in an abandoned mansion or in abandoned warehouses. But AFO's got life support machines he's on life support machines in a cave. Now, Momo highlights one of the other reasons why going and trying to go after them now is not exactly an ideal scenario, and it's because his body wasn't even complete back then. Talking about all of the issues with the conflict that they have ahead of them, and kind of establishing that under no circumstances do the heroes really have the upper hand here. All they have is the, in theory, opportunity to capitalize on Shigaraki's currently injured state, and with the fact that we have this opportunity for All for One to kind of step back into the spotlight and step up and have to fight again we got that potentially creeping around. We got some interesting potential coming forward in the story surrounding the lack of vulnerability, but also the timing of how long Shigaraki actually needs to heal going forward. And then one of the third ones is just that at the end of the day, because of everything going on, they're the ones, with them being hidden out, they've got the advantage, and as long as they don't have the information lead necessary, they cannot just go and act on their desire to take out All for One. And this is even with them already covering that Gigantomachia is still being sedated and just, tied down, not being allowed to interact and just be awake. So they're just keeping him completely unconscious going forward. Ethically, obviously, there's all these questions, and even Midnight said that it would be breaking the law, but they currently don't have a better solution for dealing with Machia. And the reality is they can't afford for him to decide he wants to wake up, fight them, and go running for All for One and tear through another city or two. That just can't happen. And Deku highlights that and Deku says something important, because he's focused on how I, or himself as an individual, can get into the fight. Looking at this situation, and Ida is the first one to reprimand him and be like, nah, we are going into this fight together. And it's worth noting that, as we've talked about, the right hand is the hand that Ida tends to discipline Midoriya with. That's the one that he punched him in the face with. It's the one that he karate chops him with. The left hand is the one that he grabbed him with when he was flying by him in Class 1A to Midoriya. So keeping up that theme and that pattern, even for a gag. Now, we see that the evacuees and the Hero Course kids have been getting along better, and that's largely because of Uraraka's speech. She's feeling extra shy. We don't know if Deku, it doesn't seem like Deku and Uraraka are really spending any one-on-one time. Mostly everybody prioritizing handling this, the conflict to come, which it makes sense. If they've been pragmatic enough to set aside attraction and stuff like that to focus on hero work when things were still relatively stable, then them setting aside those feelings to focus on hero work while things are up shit's creek just makes sense. Now, we finally cut to Invisible Girl in the forest, carrying off where we left off at the end of last chapter. And she's kind of internally monologuing about how Aoyama has been so different, and how everybody's stressed out, but Aoyama especially has just been so sad. Which really what this is telling us is not only did the war make him upset, of course, but then it was the fact that when we get to the reveal here that Aoyama has been the traitor this entire time, which I'll take a lowercase w for, because in my UA traitor video, I actually have always said that if it's a student, it's Aoyama, but I really think it's Nezu, and I still think that there's room for another traitor and for it to be Nezu. So it's just worth noting that Aoyama, before the war, didn't realize that Awful One was going to be out more than likely. And now that they actually deal with it, and that same day of the war was the Tartaristic prison break, so they knew Awful One was out of prison. And ever since then, Aoyama's been stuck with that sword of Damascus hanging over his head, knowing that he's going to be forced to deal with Awful One giving orders, and that's kind of what ends up happening in this chapter. They even, say it was up to Kimino, and then nothing Aoyama did afterwards. But Awful One is planning. They're terrified that Awful One is going to kill them. Aoyama's parents are insistent that he will kill them, and they need to save him. And we all know that Awful One is not above killing them at all. He's not just going to settle for some money. That's just not how it is. And we get confirmation that Aoyama is the one who gave away the training camp location. There's a couple of ways you could look at how this went down. You could look at it as he just happened to text somebody late at night. You could look at it as while they were en route, they just shared the GPS tracking information, and maybe Aoyama was like, okay, they were as they were on the highway when they moved towards the Pussycats camp. It was like, okay, we know that he's in that area. There's a couple of different ways that this could have gone down. He could have done something as simple as, I am blah, 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 and then shot the laser into the air the same way he did during provisional license exam to unite Class 1A to give a signal to All for One and his minions where he might be, just by simply shooting his laser into the air. Later in the day, it would light up a certain area, eventually condensing down potential locations if it wasn't something as if we're going to go with him not directly using a phone or something like that with a signal that could be tracked or intercepted. We get the explanation, and this is something that's kind of fascinating because as you look back through different Aoyama interactions, because we get the confirmation that Aoyama was actually born quirkless, and for the sake of, argument, this brings up the possibility, as far as looking at Deku's class, that the 10% of Deku's generation maybe is quirkless, and that's really not how we usually would apply this mathematics, because we've met most of Class B, and as far as we know, all of them are naturally born with quirks. So as far as the first year hero students, we're really looking at about 5% potentially of children in their generation being quirkless at this point, which would still work because of the slanted population, where if it's the same as modern Japan, about 33% of the population would be senior citizens, which would mean that a good chunk of the quirkless people would be in that senior citizen realm. So when we get that confirmation that Aoyama was afraid of being different, he wanted to be able to be a hero, or that's what he decided he wanted to do when he got his quirk, and the idea that being different is scary is kind of fascinating, especially because you understand that it was because Aoyama was so afraid of being different that he ended up in this position, so that when he became the traitor and he was going to have to do this stuff, he purposely acted especially different, which kind of made him stick out like a sore thumb. It's like he was kind of intentionally self-sabotaging the entire time, trying to get caught as a traitor, which is one of the reasons why I think it's, especially looking at Aoyama's behavior, we've kind of talked about how, in those of us who would have at least talked about why Aoyama could be the traitor, we've talked about the strangeness of his behavior, how he mentions his quirk isn't necessarily suited for his body, how he made it a point to say that where he was a secret during the USJ, whereas Hagakure, some people say she lied about where she was. I don't think she lied about where she was. I think people misunderstand that as a group they would have given reports or all come back from their zones and been like, oh, I was in this zone, and more than likely she overheard Ojiro talking to someone, and since she's always flirting with Ojiro and clearly likes Ojiro, she was trying to make her move all the way back then. So I think it has more to do with that than it had to do with her being a traitor. Obviously she could turn out to still be one, because I even said we can look at some examples of why she could be a traitor last week, but if she's not a traitor, just also realize that there's good reasons for some of her interactions, even without, you know, a malicious undertone to them within her character. So the idea that All for One, and and one of the other cool things that has been discussed is that I want to cover like some of these, is that when we got the Aoyama chapters and he was kind of being strange or whatever, or the person who came and approached Deku after he had those dreams where he got to see into the past, where All for One was exchanging the quirk for the boy who was getting rid of his quirk to protect his family, which, if you notice, it's by Aoyama grabbing a quirk from All for One that he's now put his family in danger, even though, of course, it's worth noting that Aoyama was 4 years old and his parents could have opted to not make a deal with All for One. Now, obviously, we don't know how much people know about All for One, or how, because like some people say only villains know about All for One, but to a certain degree, he's kind of like a boogeyman. Like there's like whispers about him, and with me, I see a lot of like wealth in Aoyama's family, to the extent where I feel like there's possibilities of running into All for One or some of his businesses. I think it's kind of odd for them to be able to get to All for One without knowing who he is, or at least knowing some of what he's about. So I got some questions about that, and I've seen a theory that they were kind of like All for One worshippers, and his family was, and they were big All for One fans for a long time, and only his parent generation and him really started to realize that, you know, no, this dude's messed up and we need to get away from him. But it's, you know, too late now. What I like about this is that Deku, and this kind of like reminds me of the Gentle, or the Culture Festival, and the setup for the Gentle fight, where Deku goes off to go do some random thing, where if you think about it, when Deku ended up fighting Gentle, it's because he wanted to go get a rope so that he could keep Aoyama safe. And now he's wondering how Aoyama's doing, so he's taking off again, doing another walk. But this time he runs into Hagakure, who takes him to Aoyama, who is the traitor. So now we have to figure out what the direction that Deku is going to take here. And more than likely, if Deku does end up in conflict with Aoyama and some kind of potential severe injury were to occur, it might be because of Black Whip. Kind of like how Deku got that rope for Aoyama back then, that it was set up for how the same person who held the rope to keep him safe would then hold the rope that ended his life, or something like that. That's if Horikoshi's going to really take Deku to a dark place, because I don't think that we're done tearing down Deku's mindset because of how much main character syndrome he actually has. And I understand that Deku is the main character, and we like for our main characters to do MC things and feel like they're really in charge. But it's worth noting that within the context of as being a person living within a world, Deku should not have main character syndrome, because he's still just a person within the context of how his psyche should be. So that's just something to think about. Now, I initially was a lot more sympathetic towards Aoyama's parents, but it was something about them saying that, you know, we're your loving parents that put you in this position, we're the good ones and you have to save us, and instead of them saying, do this for now and we will try to find a way to save you, our son, instead it's just save us, save us, save us, you handle this, you do this. And there's a certain level of like selfishness where even if Aoyama said he was afraid of being, you know, quirkless, they could have provided him the support emotionally and a means to get past that and be happy in life even without that. And instead they opted into getting a quirk for their child. And I think to a certain degree, some people have said that being like, there's a big argument on whether or not being born with a quirk is seen the same as being born handicapped. And a lot of people will say, well, no, quirks are something extra. But I also want to point out that for the sake of the My Hero world at this point, quirks are not an extra. They're a necessary feature that all people have that just varies across the board. So it's not quite the same as like being born without a handicap, but it is, or being born with a handicap, but it is a flag that's going to make you stand out. And because quirks can so quickly lead to lucrative careers and opportunities, especially as you're moving forward. The idea of your child not having a quirk could be seen as like a mark against you, especially in the more elite circles where people will have quirks that let them convert matter, or there are superheroes, or have quirks like Momo has, for example. All these elite quirks. So like being up amongst a bunch of aristocrats, then everything about you is going to be vetted and analyzed, and not having a quirk. So I think that his parents, in the same way that they are saying they want him to do all this and be a traitor and do all this to protect them and save them, I find it to be very reminiscent and potentially the same as them trying to get him that quirk in the first place was for their own gain socially, to make sure that they didn't look like they had bad genes or anything like that, because that's another thing that a lot of people take away from when they have children who are different like that, who are, you know, different in society, whether it's because they like can't walk, or, you know, sometimes people feel that way, like, oh, it's that person had that kind of kid, their genes are bad, they're inferior. So that's kind of something that I think Aoyama's parents were avoiding, because there's just not enough focus on them worrying about him. And when Deku pulls up and sees them together, he looks sad. You can see the dark lines, and he straight up mentions, like, you know, Hagakure just told me, you the traitor, Aoyama. And his parents immediately go to lying to Deku, which is another thing that I have strange feelings about, because immediately going to lie to Deku, these people are purely in this for themselves, and that's what makes me uncomfortable with them, where I feel like it was more to it than that. They didn't want Aoyama to disgrace them by not having a quirk, is what I feel like is going to come out in the next chapter. And I think it's going to be like, they're going to be like, oh no, Awful One's still going to kill us. Like, if something bad happens to Aoyama especially, I think we'll really start to see that come out of them. But Deku is like, look, and we see Aoyama as he's breaking down crying. He's like, I was the only one who couldn't say anything to you. Like, he couldn't talk to Deku during class 1A versus Midoriya, because he didn't feel right saying anything, knowing that now that Awful One was out, it was going to be, you know, him having to betray them again, him being part of the reason why Deku's arms are damaged the way they are, him being the reason Bakugou was kidnapped, and thus being the reason that All Might took so much extra damage, and All Might had to retire. All Might could still possibly be coasting on vestiges right now if he didn't have to reach his limit so much fighting at USJ Nobu, fighting at Kamino, doing these dangerous things. Koda almost died. Ragdoll lost her quirk. The kids were, in general, over 20 of them were injured at the camp just because of that. Tetsu was shot in the head and almost murdered. All these horrible things. So many people died at Kamino. And more than likely, Aoyama, there's a chance that Aoyama reported them to All For One back at Kamino too, and that's part of why he made it a point to be there and be active. Because you remember, they were like, he shouldn't be there, this should just be a Nomu lab. He might have even gotten there late. Part of the reason he might not have shown up until after she kicked it is because he might have just been getting there through another entrance. And that's wild to think about. And so Deku is sitting there like knowing that if he's this traitor, so he goes up and he's like, you know, you've been looking gloomy. And the thing that I find fascinating is that when I look at Deku's face in that page, he doesn't look sad necessarily to me. In that page specifically, he looks kind of angry. Like he's upset with Aoyama for this, which he has every right to be. Like, but he does look more angry than he does, you know, like sympathetic or sad when he it was like, I came out here looking for you. And, you know, people have pointed out Deku's technically wearing his USJ outfit from the very first time that Aoyama's betrayal caused him harm. And one of the things about Aoyama's face here is that he looks like he's slowly going insane. And I think Aoyama has made a very dangerous decision here. I won't swear to it, and obviously I could just be being really dark, but there's something about what he says next when his eyes fill up with blackness. He's like, yes, only me. I always wanted to feel equal. And then Aoyama says, at USJ, and the parents are like, Yuga, no. And we see the classic things fluttering from the trees. I've actually had somebody pitch to me that he might have like stabbed or injured himself here. Main issue with that is just we can see his hands, and I don't think he's making a naval saber to hurt himself. But he says, at USJ and then in the forest, each time I led them to us, do you hear me, Midoriya? I am a despicable villain. And there's this sad look on Deku's face at the point when he says that he's a villain. And this is a moment where we get to find out how Aoyama is going to approach this. Because in my mind, we know that All For One can booby trap quirks. So already by confessing, he has opened himself up to potential booby trapping. But what's more is that with what Aoyama is doing here, it looks like he's found some resolve. And it's worth noting that when Aoyama did what he did during provisional license exam, and that's the scene that we cut back to, he specifically did it because he was sacrificing himself. His goal was to sacrifice himself and fail, and then allow Ida to pass, which, if you think about when he was like, I guess I'll keep sparkling for a little more, that was more part of him being like, holy crap, I was actually able to pass. I was actually able to be a hero. And the provisional license is directly after Kamino. It's the first time he gets to be free of All For One's presence and that burden since he's been in high school, since he's been amongst 1A. This is why when you see some of the dialogue later, I believe it was around chapters 168, 169, they even say that's when we finally started to see Aoyama's true self and he stopped acting. That was future narrator Deku telling us that Aoyama was the traitor then. That's just something. But what I'm saying here is that Aoyama may be committing himself to fighting Deku here. And the reason for that might be genuinely him trying to purposely bait Deku into injuring him. Getting himself injured, crippled, potentially even killed if he can get Deku angry enough. Because I don't know about you, but I don't see Aoyama surviving a 45% smash. And I think that to a certain degree, Deku injuring Aoyama also makes it where he would be forced onto the bench, and even more so could be removed from the premises. And if that were to happen, it stops Aoyama from being able to leak any potential intel that he could have or gain by being around 1A going forward. So, in a way, Aoyama could be trying to sabotage his role as a traitor and sacrifice himself, whether it be by causing All For One to explode him, baiting Deku into a conflict, whatever the case may be, because this could be Aoyama's more or less attempt at a suicide via Deku or another person. You know, this is a tactic for a lot of guilty people, that they will intentionally interact with like law enforcement or an authority figure with the ability to harm them and then get them to kill them. It's a thing that has happened, and with Aoyama, we already have kind of this press like this in the story. We had the vinegar suicide incident, which is the incident that was talked about between Deku and Night Eye, where a kid had attempted to jump into a river and die, and then they ended up like freaking out after they turned the water into vinegar, and All Might saved them. But they don't directly mention that the kid was trying to off himself in the anime. They do in the manga, and essentially they say it was caused by the child having a bad home life. Aoyama having this home life where his parents are trying to gaslight him and make themselves the good guys and the victims in a situation where they made a deal with the devil to give their 4-year-old a quirk, just seems like the lamp shading effect, where we have this kind of like run bias in the story that these parents can drive their kids into these situations where they have to feel like they need to sacrifice themselves, and then they end up like this. And then especially because Aoyama's parents, if their reaction towards his sacrifice in the situation, if he were to antagonize Deku, because we've also seen Deku lose control, especially around the subject of All Might, multiple times. Because if you recall, what made Black Whip activate and go wild during against Aoyama, or not against Aoyama, against Monoma, was him insulting Bakugou. So Aoyama claiming he was a villain. If we start the next chapter and he starts using antagonistic language, trying to more or less make it sound like he takes pride in betraying them, he could be trying to get Deku to lose control. And we know that he lost control against Monoma. He's lost control against Bakugou. He's got a habit of losing control against the blonde boys. So he may very well end up, this may be the third time's a charm, and he loses control against Aoyama, and then that ends up being what injures him and keeps him out of line or potentially down on the mat. And then Deku has to reevaluate himself because he's going to have to deal with that guilt. But not only that, because this is the thing, because what it really comes down to, I don't want to say not only that, what it really comes down to here is that a lot of people have wanted Deku to kind of hit this wall, and they feel like Deku Far From Home, that arc didn't do enough for his development and his psyche and his progression, and that's because, but we also see that within this chapter, he was still having that loner mindset, and now this could be this conflict of like, I need to accept people, but also there's people who have been close to me and betrayed me. That sets up a dynamic and something within this character that's really going to have to give him time to stop and take pause and think about his place in the world. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing how this develops, because Deku and Aoyama's argument or conversation, wherever it goes, especially with his parents right there, it has a multitude of directions. It could be something as simple as a regular conversation, but more than likely I see Higakure leaving to go try to talk to someone else. And it's worth noting that Higakure did her internship with Aoyama. She did not follow him out of suspicion. She followed him out of friendship. They have combo moves together where she manipulates the lasers and stuff that he has. She's been friends with him during the joint training arc where they kind of like work together. So they've had a connection, an establishment. Aoyama did have that moment with Uraraka about whether or not she liked Deku. These little things happen. And then we get this. So Invisible Girl finding Aoyama is also kind of sad just for Aoyama and her. It's not just about Deku, it's about, and that's the thing, is just because we don't value or have as much time focusing on Invisible Girl or Aoyama doesn't mean that they don't have their own relationship building up in the background. And that doesn't also mean that Invisible Girl can't be some kind of traitor that's just exposing one of them to cause more dissension and make them feel like they've really made progress, only for them to be behind further than they ever have because there's more than one traitor involved entirely. That's a thing that can be on the table. I'm not saying you have to remove these things, just that some of these, this is just the direction that I see the story going. So yeah, those are just things that I've been thinking about. So, with that, I'm going to wrap that video up here. I hope you guys enjoyed it, especially if you made it to this part. Like, man, I really hope you enjoyed if you made it past 30 minutes of talking about this chapter. So, appreciate you all for coming through. Hope to see you next Sunday for the Church of MHA, recording One Piece 2, of course. I'm Aniki, and I am out.